I'm here, as I'm sure you all know, to talk about the Arnold Expedition. It happened 250 years ago this year. We're always saying that next year is the 250th. Well, actually, this year, I mean, this is the, we're 250 years from Lexington and Concord. What happened is you had Lexington Concord and 17,000 soldiers showed up. Let me go backwards a second. I should say it surprises me, but it doesn't surprise me. I left my notes at home. And so the Arnold Expedition Historical Society, it is set up about 50 years ago, a little more than 50 years ago, for the 200th anniversary. They actually built a bunch of bateaus, and some of them took them up the Kennebec. And so 50 years later, we're doing it. Now, if anybody wants to actually do the bateau trip, I'm the youngest person, -1, at the Arnold Historical Society, so you're all welcome to come. Let me... Benedict Arnold, born in Connecticut, came from a family that had been wealthy, but it no longer was. And that seemed to bother him to have. I think his dad was, unfortunately, his dad didn't recover from losing his wife and child, I believe, and just became the town drunk. And Arnold grew up not in the best of circumstances, but he sure wanted to be. He was a ship captain. He would sail to the Caribbean. I guess he made a couple of trips to Quebec. But he's not really described as a ship captain. He's more described as a merchant who happened to have a ship and sail. He also had was a member of one of the first militias in Connecticut. One of the first militias in Connecticut. It was the number 2. I think the governor's was the number 1. But they went and had all these fancy uniform and didn't look like too many of the other militias in the whole affair. Now, you had Lexington and Concord. Within days, 17,000 soldiers showed up to surround Boston. And the number of problems. One is that they had no way of attacking Boston. They didn't have the cannons that they could attack it with. But they did keep the British tied up in Boston. And in fact, most of the Revolution, that's the way things were, is the British would control a major city, but they wouldn't control big pieces of land. Arnold, marching to Cambridge, when he first learned of Lexington and Concord, ran into a guy who that guy was rushing to Connecticut to rabble-rouse. And Arnold said, there are a bunch of cannons at Fort Ticonderoga. We don't have any idea how he knew that. There's no record of him ever being anywhere near there, but he somehow knew there were a bunch of cannons there. And he told this guy going back. Well, the guy going back found a couple of Connecticut hooligans. They might have been politicians, I don't know, and got them. And the Connecticut guy says, let's go attack Fort Ticonderoga. And he went up, and he was related to Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. So we had all the Green Mountain Boys all riled up to go attack Ticonderoga. Arnold went to Cambridge, got an official rank of colonel, and was told he could go attack Ticonderoga, but he had to raise his own men. And so he was heading over, and he found out, oh my God, these people have gone ahead of me. And so he rushes over by himself and goes in with these Ethan Allen, the Mountain Boys, which were a bunch of hooligans, and goes and says, I'm in charge here. And they're like, nah, I don't think so. But he did not back down, and he managed to, be the co-leader of the group that attacked Fort Ticonderoga. The important thing to Arnold's story is already he has irritated the hell out of some important people. Already there were people who were absolutely furious with him and doing what they could to push him aside, ruin his reputation. They took Ticonderoga. I think there were 40 soldiers there. They weren't prepared for this. They then went and took the next fort, Crown Point, and then Arnold went and attacked the upper end. Actually, it's the lower end in the north, because Lake Champlain flows north. He took British fort and burnt what British ships were there, and he found letters that said there are only 900 British soldiers in Canada. When I talk about Canada, when they talk about Canada, you're basically talking the St. Lawrence River Valley. You're not talking Nova Scotia. You're not talking Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, what have you. You're talking the river valley. But he found this thing saying they're basically only 900 soldiers, and most of them are marching to Lake Champlain. And so he set up a plan for attacking Canada, like how many soldiers you would need, how much equipment, how many shovels, how many pickaxes, everything you would need to attack Canada. And he mailed this letter to the Continental Congress, and in the letter he says, you should find somebody with more knowledge than I. If you can't find somebody, I'll do it, but there's got to be people who have more experience than I do. During this time period, he irritated more people. His wife and father-in-law died, and which destroyed him, and he was headed back to Connecticut to deal with that. Let's go for another picture. That would be a good idea. There was one really traditional way for the armies, either the British or the French or the Indians, to attack, Canada or say New York. And this one, way that it was always done was up the Hudson, through Lake Champlain, and down to the St. Lawrence. It was not that hard a journey. And during the French and Indian War, there probably were 1,500 bateaus built to use during that war. The British had a group called the Bateau Service, So it was like they were basically the pickup trucks and what have you that would move all the equipment. And the funniest thing about the bateau men is they were paid 1.5 times what the common soldiers were. They also acted like a mafia-run Teamsters union. They were like, no, we're not doing that. No, we're done for the day. Forget it. And the officers would write about how horrible they were, but they would also write about how the common soldier would cause more problems than using the experienced bateau men. So here you have the major route for attacking. The one other thing is you have also going up the Hudson to Albany, and if you go west on the Mohawk, you'll end up in Lake Ontario. And that's where the Erie Canal ended up, that route. But these were basically the two routes to move large armies, either to Canada or down to New York or what have you. There were three other routes. One was to go up to Connecticut, and that wasn't in any way a great way to go. One was to go up to St. John, which is now at St. John, New Brunswick, and that wasn't a great way to go. The third way was to sail up to the St. Lawrence, and you needed a navy to do that. Well, there was a fourth way, and that was to go up to Kennebec. And you will read things claiming that no white man had ever done it except for this one guy named Lieutenant Montresor. Well, that's not quite true, because this is a map done in 1754 of the route, and it's pretty accurate. And there are a number of maps before the Revolution, some better than others, showing the route. There were a number of plans to attack this way. The governor, Shirley of Massachusetts, which to a certain extent, I think he was in charge of everything, New England, maybe New York also, he sent 500 soldiers and a bunch of bateaus up the Kennebec in 1555 to see if there were any French at Chaudière, which is once you've gone over the Canadian border, over the height of land, you're now on the downriver side to the St. Lawrence. But there had been people sent to check this out. You folks familiar with the name Remington Hobby? No? Well, you're familiar with the name Getchell. Remington Hobby and Getchell and three other men were sent to check this out in April by the city of Portland, city of Falmouth. It's now Portland. This route was known, but not really what you could do with it. And at this point in time, the Army moved with wagons. You didn't send guys off expecting them to carry everything on their backs. There probably was well over 100 tons of food and equipment and what have you sent on the Arnold Expedition. The average bateau probably carried 1,600 pounds plus the soldiers. And we always think the soldiers went in the bateaus. They didn't. Only 2 soldiers would go in a bateau, and I will get back to that. There's a shipbuilder named Reuben Colburn, and his house still exists in Pittston on the Kennebec, not that far below Randolph, and he went down. He was very active in promoting a rebellion, and he went down to Cambridge when a bunch of Native Americans went through down on Swan Island, headed for Cambridge, and he goes with them, and he goes and he talks to George Washington about having the Native Americans join the fight. There's completely contradictory information as to whether or not they accepted them. Some authors will say no, they did not, and other authors will say they did. So you get some real contradictory information on that. But George Washington and Benedict Arnold had some experience. They weren't idiots. And so if some guy shows up from the backwoods of Maine and suggests going up the Kennebec and says he can provide them with the boats that are needed, he must have really been able to do it. Now, we always say he had 2 weeks to build 200 bateaus. I think that would have taken 56 men to build those bateaus. I think it would have taken 25 men to make all the paddles and oars and poles. Then he was also asked to get food, I'm sure maybe other supplies. And then George Washington sent 11,000 men to Maine. So obviously, you know, they were smart enough to know this probably can work, you know. Now, one thing we always forget is the first letter that we know of, sent to Reuben Colburn, says, can you procure or build 200 bateaus? And there were a couple of thousand people living on the river by then. And I imagine some guy goes around in the fall and says, you know that leaky piece of crap, I'll give you a couple of bucks for it and build you a good one over the winter. So they did come up with boats. Some were very in bad shape. Some there are no complaints about. Boy, I wish I had my papers at home. You know, besides in just a couple of weeks having to build all these bateaus, all these oars, all these paddles, all these everything, he was asked to come up with 60 barrels of salt beef and other food sources. And again, you got to think, this is Maine going into the winter. How much extra did they have on short notice, and how much labor did they have on short notice? Well, they obviously did have it, but we need to factor that in when we figure out building these boats. There are little records of, you know, this guy selling a barrel of flour and a pair of oars to Colburn. There's an interesting one about two Quakers selling paddles, selling 50 paddles to Colburn, even though they refused to go in the army. There's also, I find this, I deal with a lot of, I have this hobby of looking up information that's completely of no use. I've done Boston Tea Party ships. I've done the 1607 Papua New Colony. I've done the Vikings in Greenland, and I'll find all this information that says, okay, our story is wrong, but it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference to the story. One of our great stories is that there was a loyalist who would not sell nails to Reuben Colburn. And so the soldiers went over and broke into his store and stole the nails. Now, there's a slight problem with that story, is the soldiers didn't show up till the boats were built. So, but they, you know, it could be that the local militia, and I mean there were Minutemen, so it could be accurate, but you'll find a lot of that, these stories that aren't quite, well, you know, but they make great stories. They make great stories. 2017, we built this bateau. The tall guy is Harding Carter, and he is always trying to find ways to kill me. I do not know how to swim, but 30 years prior we had built a Viking boat and sailed it from Greenland to Baffin Island down the coast of Labrador, Newfoundland. But I happened to bring Arundel to read. And Arundel is how most people who know the Arnold story know it from the Arundel book. Well, he came up with this idea, and we made copies of the 1975 bateau, and it turned out to have some flaws. And the guy who came up with the 1975 bateau afterwards said, no, there's some problems with it, okay? But so we have come up with a different design. This is actually the 1975. You can see how little freeboard there is. Now we are leaking, we just launched it, so we may be sitting a little low, and this is the design we've come up with for this year. And the guys, the Friends of Fort Halifax, have built one of these. I'm building a couple 2 feet shorter because I want to. Plus the building was small. There's not a lot of definite information about these boats. They're flat bottom, they're planked fore and aft, double-ended. That's a huge amount that's all there is. The sides vary from being just about plumb to, by the time you get to logging bateaus, they lay way out. The stems go from being just about plumb to just this insane raking out. Do I know how to go back? There we go. You can see these long overhangs. That makes sense if you want to stick somebody with a bunch of dynamite onto a mess of logs, you know. But besides that, it's not the best idea, because it's the most comfortable place. You want to sit up there, and of course then you have no stability because all that weight isn't supported by the water. But and one other thing about the bateau is the most important thing is that the bottom was flat. Not a 2-inch rocker, you know, not a little bit to it, that the bottom was flat. Now the very ends, it would turn up, but through the bottom, they made sure it stayed flat. And our grandparents, when they went canoeing in, you know, the summer in Maine, they would have 20-foot old towns because the bigger the boat, the less depth of water. You put 1,600 pounds of cargo in a boat, you get a couple of farm boys and say, take it up the river. By the time they got to Fort Halifax, they'd worn the bottoms out of some of them. So as little depth of water. That is one of the most major criteria about the boats. There were no uniforms. The soldiers supplied all their clothes, all their weapons. I've been going, and I hope I'll get to this. I've been doing research of all the Maine soldiers, and there's like 75 of them, and almost none of them are married. They're all single. But interesting thing, and a lot of them are in their mid-20s, but almost none of them are married, and none of them have children. Okay, and if you're lucky, you'll find out why that's important. So here's Fort Western. This was as far as the sailboats could go, Even some of the sailboats couldn't make it there, mostly because, you know, bad piloting, I guess. But that's the height of the tidal Kennebec. The boats were built 6 miles below there. They unloaded the cargo here because if you ever moved anything heavy, you don't move it any further than you have to. And one of the things that's left out for most of the journals is you do have a waterfall there, and besides the water or rapids, besides the rapids, you have about a 5-foot tidal rise and fall. There actually was buildings up the river. Howard, who owned the fort, had his house up there, and the rapids were much worse than they are now. They blew up a lot of the obstructions in those rapids, but there's no talk about having to portage cargo from the tidal water up a half a mile or two. That section is easy, and so you have to assume that they took by land above the rapids. There was a lousy road up to Fort Halifax that had been let go because, you know, what with the French and Indian War being over, there was a lousy road, but mostly they took boats that could carry two tons of cargo up to Fort Halifax. And this is Fort Halifax. Took them about 2 days to get here, and by the time they got here, they already had done some serious damage to some of the bateaus. And like I say, you try to make them light because some poor guy is going to have to carry it on his shoulders. You try to make it as light as you can, and then you give it to some farm boys and tell them to drag it upriver. So it's not like you're flying downriver and hit something. You're going upriver. You ground out, and then you just keep hauling on it while that poor pine bottom is getting scraped over the rocks. Now, they did also lose control of them. One of the journals, the guy talks about they tried like 8 times and failed at one point. And then they hired 2 Indians who'd just been following along, and the 2 Indians just up the rapids they go. It is not a skill easily learned. It's not a skill you learned in an afternoon. I haven't seen any record where they say somebody started not knowing how to do it and 2 weeks later was excellent at it. You know, there's no mention about, oh yeah, okay, I can do it now. They spent a lot of time in the water because they lacked the skill. And this is written down in the journals and by Arnold that they lacked the skill. This is a idealized picture. There are 5 or so people in the bateau. You would never have 5. They had 2, maybe 3. And each mess of 6 guys, you know, you'd alternate days. Sometimes there would just be 2. There are people who recorded they never rowed until they had got to the Dead River. It was all basically being in the water and poling. You will notice there's one guy with his pole is pointing forward, and the boat behind him, the boat is pointing aft. So they obviously had different techniques. These are idling power units. These are antique cows. During the bicentennial, we realized there were a lot of cows, a lot of sheep, a lot of chickens that were going extinct because they were not the profitable one to own. And one of these types of cows was the American milking Devon. And there's now 600 of them, and they were the all-purpose. You could raise it as a milk cow, you could raise it as a steer, which means for meat, or you could raise it for an oxen. And they had some oxen go up the river, and they would help carrying cargo around the portages. It still was easier to have 4 men carry the bateau, but they would carry the cargo around the portages. And just an example, you guys have the first waterfall. I had it on my piece of paper, Titanic. What was it? Titanic. That was the first real portage. Some of the soldiers wrote in their journals, this is where we really learned how to be soldiers. Probably more than a mile. And when they got to the end of it, they had 5 miles of what they called rapids. And some of them comment they didn't think they could do the rapids, but they managed to get up that 5 miles. Now that's gone thanks to the dam. When we did this in 2017, we had something that they didn't have. Harding likes to have everything be authentic when I build the boat. The more we get on the trip, we can, oh yeah, let's get a truck, let's do whatever. But we got to the first waterfall and we had block and tackle and all the rest, and we were dragging it up around the waterfall. But one thing that we had that they did not have 250 years ago is that we had young drunken fishermen. And a bunch of guys helped carry the bateau around the first Waterville Dam. This is the Skowhegan Falls, and actually, as nasty as that looks, you don't see a lot of complaints about this one being worse. I guess going over the fall, as long as the distance isn't there. And this is, again, a modern, semi-modern painting of hauling the bateaus at Skowhegan. Movies, and this is a pet peeve of mine, movies and paintings done currently do a horrible job of showing how to move a heavy object. I can't really, this one still sort of gets me, but you watch a modern movie about reenacting Lewis and Clark, and you look at that and you say, those guys wouldn't live a day, what it is. And, we had 50,000 years of knowing how to move heavy objects. One thing that's happened in the boatyard is boatyards used to be a lot of fun, because you always had to ask at some point 10 guys to help you move something. We're not like that anymore. We have forklifts, we have cranes, we can be assholes. We don't need to be nice anymore. But carrying the bateaus was a 4-man job. It'd probably be about 100 pounds apiece. It could not be 6. You'd have 2 in the front, 2 in the stern, and the reason for that is you could have as many people as you want on a piece of flat land. But if you're going up and over rocks and everything, the 2 guys in the middle, half the time they have the whole weight and half the time they have none of it. So it was a 4-person carry. It's estimated the boats weighed 400 pounds, so that's 100 pounds a person. The voyageurs, the fur traders, they carried a minimum of 180 pounds on a carry. So, people were used to carrying heavy items. This is how we did it at Skowhegan. The Skowhegan school system has a river rescue class. And we just showed up there, having no idea about them. And here are all these teenagers, and And they helped carry the boat around. Above that you have Madison and Anson, and then you have one more Caratunk Falls to go around. Madison and Addison, which was called the Norjawak Falls, caused a lot of grief. By then, a number of boats had to be repaired. A lot of the food was condemned. They brought the fish just loose, dried salted fish just sitting in the bilges of the boat. Some of the barrels were not waterproof. The ones that carried the peas, the ones that carried the bread, they were not waterproof. Now, this would be a good time to blame the boat builders, but at this point in time, there were laws against letting your cargo get wet. I mean, they knew about that, going in a bateau was a wet thing. And if you let your cargo get wet, you would pay a fine for every barrel you let get wet. At the Norjawak Falls, they condemned the beef, which also seemed to have been put aside poorly. The peas, and basically they were down to flour and salt pork. What I'm a little curious about is I have not heard anything about them going well. The fish that's sitting in the bottom, we had to eat those right away because they won't, I didn't hear anything about, doesn't mean they didn't, just didn't hear anything about that. They were not getting much wild game. If you send 1,100 men through the woods, the deer and the moose are going to know you're coming, So they did not get much wild game. But the Great Carry is a 10,000-year-old trail. Basically, since the Ice Age, that was the route the Wabanaki took. And it saves you this big horseshoe of the Kennebec, which is not runnable with a birch bark canoe. It's probably not runnable with a bateau either. But so they had this 13-mile carry. It had 3 ponds in the middle of it. Part of the problem, what have you, is the first 3 miles they had to climb something like 900 feet. That's a bit of a hike going up. Boy, I sure hope you can edit all these ums out of it. That's probably half of the film, It is interesting, some soldiers, there are 16 journals by officers. There are 16 journals by privates. Some of the soldiers complain about the boats, some of them complain about the carries, and then you'll have other ones that do not mention anything about their boat being bad, do not mention anything about the carries being bad. I've just found out that they would name their boats or mark their boats. There's one journal that says he named the boat the Charming Betsy after his wife, okay? Okay, fine, so a guy names it the Charming Betsy. Well, I have found that, say French and Indian War, you have 200 bateaus, you would mark it at least with the regiment, and maybe more information than that, and you figure one reason is, you got 200 bateaus, you just got it, you may not recognize your bateau, and when you know that you have a good one, you want to get it the next day. So they would mark their bateaus. With the soldiers in the French and Indian War, they also used that as a way of, if the bateau got damaged, they would punish the soldiers. Took about 5 days to get across the carry. This was, back and forth, back and forth. We did it in 5 days also. And we didn't do anything more than bring the bateau one way. All the rest of these guys had to bring the bateau, bring the barrels, bring the oars, their guns, their clothes. You know, they could be making 8 or 7 round trips or 7 trips to get their gear. We did it in 5 days, but the problem we had was there was a road. Of course that slowed us. Of course that slowed us down. And you'll see there's no cargo. And the funniest thing is that all 5 days, these old people would come wandering out of the woods. This is a section that you need a key to get through a gate. All these old people would just come wandering out of the woods. The youngest person was 68. The oldest, I think, was this little woman in her 80s. I don't have the photo, but I had a picture of her with 2 logs under her arms. Because basically we just sat there and moved rollers, you know, in front of the boat and rolled it and rolled it and rolled it. And we cheated. We had a pickup truck bring all our cargo around. I could not convince those guys to even try carrying it on their shoulders. They were not willing to try that. Just for the hell of it. You see that woman on the left working hard? She's a state representative. You want to say the politicians don't work hard? Look at what she's doing right there. She's also my wife. Whoops. And what was left of the idling power units became a source of protein. By the time they got across the Great Carry, they butchered the last oxen they had and ate them. What am I doing wrong? Around this time, across the Great Carry, the last, there were 4 groups. The last group quit. You know, a number of them were from Woolwich, my town. So I always like to call them the Woolwich quitters. And writers have criticized them greatly, okay? But let's say, okay, you have 3 groups of 3 companies and 1 group of 4 companies. You know, it's not just like a straight odds that all 3 of the companies that quit will come from the last company. They were obviously witnessing, you know. And so in other words, by the time these guys had got there, the belief was that the path would be cleared, there'd be shelters left for them, the river would be cleared, and so they were given probably 4 or 5 times the weight to carry that the first guys were. Now the problem with that idea is, the way I see it, and it had been raining, by the time the 4th group comes, these guys who have walked this route 7 times have turned it into this horrible muddy mess. They've probably burnt every piece of firewood anywhere near the logical campsites. I don't know how they dealt with their waste. They may have contaminated the water by that time. The Middle Carry Pond gave a lot of guys dysentery or diarrhea, though I don't know exactly why. But the last group is carrying this tremendous amount, going up and witnessing all this lost food, all these destroyed boats, okay? Chances are by the time they got to the Great Carry, they had witnessed 75, 100 destroyed bateaus and all that lost food, you know. At the upper end of the Great Carry, one of the companies, one of the groups, three companies, have already run out of food. They've been out of food for like 5 days. Now, they're only halfway through. They were thought to go 45 days. They'd only gone half that, and they had no food, And so this last group gets up there, sees that there's no food. Arnold says, send everybody back except for the ones you can give 5 days worth of food. Well, nobody was eating a day's worth of food at that time. So if they meant a real 5 days worth of food, you weren't talking about a lot. But this last group went back and have been condemned in writing, and condemned by the soldiers who went forward. They did not quit the revolution. This last group went back to Cambridge and continued to fight through the revolution. A lot of the soldiers, one soldier from Woolwich started as a substitute for a person who had to drop out when it went through Woolwich. He started it as a substitute and ended up as a lieutenant colonel. Quite a number of these guys, starting off as privates, ended up as sergeants, lieutenants, what have you. A lot of these people were committed to the revolution, and so even though they were from the Lower Kennebec, they didn't quit. They went back to Cambridge and continued in the revolution. Anus was court-martialed, which is, I think we always think, oh, that means he's guilty. No, they're trying to find out what happened. And now, of course, none of the people who didn't turn back are there at the court-martial, but the witnesses are the people who did turn back. But there is a letter written by like 23 professional officer soldiers after the court-martial, and they said he did the right thing. That's what he should have done. The head of the Kennebec soldiers went up from being a captain to being a colonel and being in charge of the Lincoln County militia. And back then, that basically means he was in charge of an army. It wasn't people who met every other weekend at the bowling alley. I mean, this was a real army. Come on. Okay. Wool. Wool was very nice. I'm in red. I'm wearing all wool except for some chinos over wool long underwear. And it's raining and probably about 38 degrees. And we've already probably capsized 10 times in 2 days. And I love cold weather. I'm loving every minute of it. Come on. What have I done? Nope. This is the 2017 bateau. This is going up almost to the chain of ponds. And that is what it's like going up that last bit. There must have been a lot less water. At this point, why bother? I mean, you're not carrying any cargo. Why bother bringing the boat? They had had a flood a few days earlier, and it had raised the water 8 feet overnight. I mean, it's amazing. They continued on. Seems like most of them just did it by laying in the bow and grabbing bushes and pulling themselves along. And this again is the chain of ponds. This is between, and as you can see, we're just going to drag it. Now, this also explains why you'd wear the bottom out of a bateau. And again, no cargo in it. This actually, they would not have experienced this. We had the easy thing. They had their flood, their hurricane, and they had to fight the current. We got our flood, which gave us water. Oops, sorry. We capsized 15 times. I'm trying to get him to give me his underwear because I've run out of caulking to pound into the seams. Now Harding offers his underwear, but I'm like, I'm not taking that. He's got to talk to the Queen when we get to Canada. But there's another part of this video you won't see where I'm having to nail 6 feet of the sideboard to the bottom. And this one, what you're seeing there, that's not how you do. You don't put caulking from the inside, but when you split your planks, and nope. And here is down the easy way, downriver. What happened? No signal. Do any of you young kids know what that means?
Did a cord get loose or something?
Get your power plugged in on your laptop.
Okay, I got power to the laptop. Please check. Well,
We can turn it off and turn it back on. That's what solves everything, right? I'm going to turn off the
okay.
and turn it back on.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure that.
Because nothing should have timed out because you've been moving it and changing the screen, so you can ignore that part. It'll always say that at the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like for some reason it looks like your laptop is restarting.
You know,
Do you think it's not charging?
I hadn't been looking.
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
Oh, yeah, it's almost out. Yep.
All right, let's see.
But it does look like it's charging now. So.
Darn. Oh boy, I think I would have thought I would usually, 1% remaining. I'm going to shut it down for a second. Yeah, I get this little yellow orange light that means I am charging. There we go. And this thing often charges. Most of the Army were walking by this time. They had walked across the height of land, and very, very few bateaus got carried over to, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Lac Megantic, big lake there, and the Chaudière flows out of Lac Megantic. In fact, the soldiers called it Chaudière Pond. One of the different little tidbits I got from reading pension applications is that some of the Kennebec soldiers made it all the way to the Chaudière Pond. You know, whereas the historians, whatever, will always say they ended at the Great Carry. The other thing is, like, we always seem to say, oh yeah, the carpenters came at the end. That doesn't make any sense. You put the carpenters all throughout the length of it to maintain the boats as you go along. This is the first time, basically crossing the height of land, this is the first time they mention women. And often we will say that there were 2 women on the trip. And well, first of all, I know there were 3, but I also think the possibility is that there were plenty more. And the reason I say that is you don't mention someone unless it's unusual, okay? They've just marched for 6 weeks from Cambridge to the Canadian border, and these 3 women get mentioned because of an unusual event. Why wouldn't, then that could mean there are other women on the trip. At this point in time, in the regular British Army, if you had 100 soldiers, you had room for 25 more women and children. And a very good reason for this is if you go and Shanghai some hooligan in Liverpool and send him here for 12 years and he leaves his wife and children, Liverpool now has another widow and orphan to take care of. Women and children accompanied the battle, okay? Accompanied the army. Women were allowed to do everything except for cook. They could wash clothes, they could mend clothes. For some reason, they weren't allowed to cook. Maybe they were worried the women would steal some food and give it to their kids, I don't know. But for some reason, the women weren't allowed to cook. I have recently found out a friend of mine, he was doing research on his ancestors. He has a female ancestor during the Revolution who was in a prison hulk, the old beat up British ships like in New York Harbor. She was in the hulk. I don't remember what he told me. I think maybe she'd been a spy, but she was arrested, and or captured, and in the prison hulk, and she met a guy there and married him. I mean, that's his ancestors. Now, I found a pension application. The country started giving pensions to soldiers 45 or more years after the war. They sort of hoped they'd all be dead by then, but that didn't work out. So they started giving them pensions, and you would have to say who your officers were, say how long you'd served, say what your rank is, but you would also have to say, you'd have to get other people, if you can find them, to witness your application, and you had to say what you owned, and you didn't have to list your clothes, your bedding. You had to list everything else, and you'd be reading these guys, and they'd say, "I have 3 chairs, 2 forks, 1 broken shovel." I mean, we're talking some real poverty, and they're always going to say, and my wife, has been ill for 10 years, and I have a son who's, not there, and what have you. But, but anyways, looking at these pension applications, I went down a soldier's name, and it turned out it wasn't the soldier I wanted. I mean, he just had a common name or what have you. I go down this soldier's name and I find out he's a black man, and before the war is over, he's given a furlough and he marries a black woman. And then they immediately return to the army, and she is enlisted into the army. And in the 1830s, she's given a pension. And it's like, that just absolutely amazed me, that this woman was getting a pension.
Was that the Revolutionary War?
This was a revolution. It was 1782, so that's towards the end. Her husband actually was hung in 1787 for stealing, and I want to say in the 1830s, she was collecting a pension for having been in the army, which just amazes me. I think the other thing is, again, my whole thing about how if it's not unusual, you don't write it down. And so that's why I'm thinking that there could be more women than get written down. There's basically no mention of a black person, okay? And there's like two that, you don't know. But same thing, if it's not unusual, why write it down, Constantly, Arnold is sending letters through the Maine woods, through New York to Montgomery over on Lake Champlain. He's not sending some farm boy from Woolwich, he's sending an Indian. But there's so little, there's occasional, but basically there's almost no mention of the Indians on the expedition. Let's see what... Well, what you're missing is we're going down the Chaudière and you are watching wave after wave come into the boat. And the beautiful thing is that a wooden boat doesn't sink. You have to have things that will sink in the boat. But otherwise, if everything in the boat floats, including human beings, the boat doesn't sink. And we got it over to shore, which was good, because around the corner was a big waterfall that we had thought was a number of miles further ahead.
Do you want to try it again?
Yeah.
What's the charge level right now? Did that before?
Oh gosh, it doesn't. No, well.
At least it says it's charging.
Well, that right there is my charge level. And well, it says 18%.
Oh, it's back on the screen.
So... let's see if I've got the right one. Going down the Chaudière, they basically walked. Oh. Going down the Chaudière, they basically walked. They had brought very few boats over the height of land. One company of riflemen brought 7 boats, and as soon as they went down the Chaudière, they wrecked them. I think only maybe one bateau and one canoe survived going down the Chaudière. By now, the soldiers were starving. They were eating their shoes. They were eating anything they had that was leather. They were eating their candles, which would be tallow. They were eating shaving soap. They ate a couple of dogs. I'm amazed the dogs lasted that long. I would have thought they'd eaten them a lot sooner. but they were eating their dogs. The order from Arnold was every man for himself. You know, don't keep going as a unit. You know, every man has to try to get to the end. There are stories of, you know, soldiers, you know, taking his last steps, sitting down and being dead. You know, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but there are stories like that. This is one of the stories about the women. One of the stories about a woman was written by or at least he witnessed it when he was 15, 16 years old, is they're breaking through the ice and the woman has her skirts way up, and he said nobody would dare. You know, she was a great woman, very virtuous, and nobody would have said anything about that. The other story is recorded in 2 different journals, and it sounds like the exact same story. It sounds, you know, husband, you know, gives up, the wife waits till he dies, and then she goes and rejoins the army. But the dates in the journals don't work out, and one wife rejoins the army in 20 hours. The other wife doesn't rejoin the army for 3 weeks. So, and, you know, and again, an unusual event, you know, watching this poor woman, you know, sit there while her husband starves to death. Around this time, after they'd gone a couple of, 50, 60 miles down the Chaudière, Arnold had raced ahead and got food. And so he had some French peasants march these cows and I think a couple horses and what have you back up the Chaudière and to feed the soldiers. The soldiers write about, they're amazed by the French peasants. You got to figure these are all New England Protestants, and they were just amazed at how good a people these French Catholic peasants were. They get to the St. Lawrence, obviously on the wrong side, but you know, they get to the St. Lawrence. The British have known they're coming by now. The British have burnt every small boat they can find up and down the St. Lawrence. They finally go and gather up enough boats, and one dark night, 500 out of 560 paddle these canoes across the St. Lawrence. And they managed to do it practically undetected. At the very end, they shot at some sentries, but practically undetected. And then they climb up the same secret route that Wolfe took to the Plains of Abraham. And they have no food. They're naked. They probably only have one gun for 10 people, you know. But they sit up there and they stare at Quebec. And they stare at Quebec. A couple weeks later, they do retreat a little bit. First they walk up and says, "Oh, we think you should surrender." And the British answer by firing a cannon at them. And after they've done that once or twice, they decide they'll hold off on that. And they go and they march upriver a little bit. The whole plan was that Montgomery, with 2,000 soldiers, would come up Lake Champlain to Montreal, come up down the St. Lawrence, and capture Quebec City. And they figure if they control Quebec City, because by then they would have controlled all of Canada, if they get Quebec City, they'll have a good bargaining chip with the British. You know, a lot of people didn't want to remove from Britain. You know, a lot of people thought if we could just talk to the king, it's that damn parliament, but they just thought if we can talk to the king, well, when they finally got a chance to talk to the king, he's like, we ought to hang them all. But that was the theory on taking Quebec City. So you have 2,000 men supposedly coming up Lake Champlain. You have 1,000 men supposedly coming up the Kennebec. By the time they get to Quebec City, I think Montgomery had 2,000, maybe 3,000 soldiers and 300 soldiers and a couple of hundred Canadians who were fighting on our side. Arnold had a few more, but not a lot more. And one of the things to remember is Arnold, once Montgomery shows up, Arnold isn't in charge. And that doesn't bother him. He liked generals and what have you. Arnold is no longer in charge. So they sit there for 6 weeks. And they had Montgomery brings all these captured British uniforms. So all these American soldiers are wearing British redcoats, and they put a little twig of hemlock in their hat so that, they'll know he's, yeah. And they've been staring at these walls for 6 weeks. And I hate to say this, the first battle, they lost it because of Yankees. And I hate to say that because my family's been here before there was a country. But what happened was everybody you had an enlistment. And a lot of the enlistments at that point ended on the first of the year. And, you don't fight in the winter. You have a gun with gunpowder that's exposed to the weather, and you go out on some wet snowstorm. You don't fight. You don't fight in the winter, all right? And so their enlistments ended. So these guys had sat there for 6 weeks, staring at those huge stone walls. The last day of their enlistment, they're like, yeah, I'll go attack the city. And it's like, I would have said, I think I have a splinter. Here they're all saying, we will not stay. We are leaving tomorrow, but we will attack the city today, even though we've been looking at these stone walls, right? Well, to go along with the Arnold Expedition's bad luck is, it was amazing how often there were deserters flowing both directions. And an American deserter had told the English that we were going to attack on like the 28th. And so they moved it a couple of days. And on the 31st, there happened to be a storm and dark and everything. But the plan was the small Canadian groups would go to the top of the city and just make a disturbance. And then Montgomery, with his New York men, would come down the river on a very narrow path that some say it was only 2 people wide because the big ice from the St. Lawrence would, shove up. So it was only 2 people wide. Montgomery goes down. He's leading the group. They don't think they're going to run into much of a British presence, and they get through a barricade. And they start chopping it up. And the British and militia and whatever, they all run away. Except for one British soldier. Before he runs away, he lights the cannon. And it fires. And it kills Montgomery. And it kills the next person in charge. I think it may kill the third person in charge. Killed about 10 people. And the rest of the people quit. Now, you got to remember, it's 4 o'clock in the morning or something. It's a snowstorm, and you're walking down something 2 people wide, and you have no idea what's just happened in front of you, And you might not have an officer. You might not have anybody who's, saying this what needs to be done. So Montgomery is dead. His soldiers retreat. On the other side of the town, Arnold attacks. I don't know if you've been in Quebec, but basically it's up there. But there's a bit of a waterfront, and it was a much smaller waterfront then. Arnold attacks, is going through these narrow streets, again in this snowstorm, and right away, Arnold gets badly shot in the leg. And so he's taken to a hospital. And he doesn't want to be, but they take him to a hospital. Okay, Arnold was very good at leading his men. You know, now right at the beginning, they've lost this guy. So a guy named Morgan, who went on to become a general in the army, Morgan takes over, and they attack a barricade, and they capture it, and they capture like over 100 soldiers. Okay, now these Americans, what the hell do we do with 100 prisoners? You know, so that caused them a problem. And then they come to another barricade. And the problem is, by now, the British know that Montgomery's dead. The Americans don't know this. The British know that the American's dead. And so they send troops down to where Arnold is, behind him. So now you have the American troops are squeezed between, you know, people in front of them, people behind them. They do fight for a couple of hours. The feeling is that only 1 gun in 10 fired because of this heavy, wet snow. But eventually, lack of ammunition, lack of gunpowder, they surrender. Okay, they're, you know, taken up into a nunnery, I think, maybe a hospital, and there's only a couple hundred Americans who don't get captured. So the Americans have been captured, and the British are very nice to them. I always think that instead of saying liberty or death on their little piece of paper on their hat, it should have said liberty or biscuits, because right away they get fed. The Governor General of Canada was named Guy Carleton. Probably at least 15 of these prisoners years later named their son Guy Carleton after the guy who held them as a prisoner, you know. The Americans who've been caught don't think they've been defeated. They think that guys out there, their guys, will attack again. The Americans in prison come up with a pretty good plan, and I think they've managed to send somebody out who managed to get to the American, you know, and they send an American out to the Americans and tells them what their plan is. The problem is, some people think there was a British spy all along in with the Americans. It fits, whatever. Somehow, at the very last minute, the British find out about their plan, and, you know, come in and lock them all up even more and what have you. But the Americans are, it's a race. It's a race between how many American soldiers can come up Black-Shaped Plain and go to Quebec before the ice goes out. And by the time the ice goes out, they've gotten 3,000 soldiers surrounding Quebec. The problem is 1,000 of them have smallpox, you know. But the Americans, you know, these guys weren't insane. You know, soldiers were coming. The ice goes out, and 10,000 British soldiers sail in, and immediately land and attack the Americans. The general in charge had only been there for a couple of days. He was planning retreating. He just never thought the British would attack the very minute they landed. And so the British did a very good job of pushing the Americans back and pushing them back. Now, people my age hate this, but Ho Chi Minh would not call this a loss, okay? The Americans lost that first battle, but the British, they continued to fight the British as the British pushed them back. And they fight the British and lose. And then they fight the British and lose. And they go through the summer like this until October. And by October, they've been pushed back onto Lake Champlain, and they're cobbling together a navy. And on October 10th, the British sailed down Lake Champlain, or up, thank you, sail up Lake Champlain, and Arnold is hiding behind Valcour Island. And the British sail past him and then realize that's where he is.
And they're downwind.
And they're downwind. And, you know, when you're sailing, you know, there's a whole 90 degrees you can't touch. And so now Arnold has the upper hand, but he still has just rafts and what have you. And Arnold and his men fight the British for a day and lose. But they do a pretty good job fighting them. One of the people killed was one of the people from the Kennebec, who, when his group went back and went to Cambridge, then volunteered to go to Canada, to go to Montreal, Canada. So one of the people killed was a person who had been on the Arnold Expedition and had gone back. The Americans scuttle what boats they have left and they flee. The British go, look, the fighting season is over. Why don't we go back to Montreal, which is right there. We know there are barracks, there's food, there's heat. We'll go spend the winter there, rather than go down to Ticonderoga and rebuild this destroyed fort. So the British go back. That gives the Americans, half a year or more to prepare for the next year. The next year, the British come, 6,000 plus soldiers come down, marching mostly, but some on the water, come marching down Lake Champlain, and they attack the Americans at Saratoga. And I told you about how Arnold tends to make people not like him. Well, the general of all of the North, in 1776, said all my officers are useless except for Arnold. Okay, by 1777, he's even managed to irritate that guy. So he's told, you're not to have any part in the battle. Okay, he's confined to his tent. And he sits there in his tent, and he observes what's going on, and he realizes these troops need to be rallied. And he jumps on a horse and races out and saves the day of the battle. I mean, in many ways, he is why we won the Battle of Saratoga, which might have been the first time a whole British army was captured.
6,000.
6,000 soldiers, yeah. And again, he gets shot in the leg. Same leg. Okay. You can't have the battlefield park and not mention Arnold. So there's a statue to Arnold in Saratoga. I think it went up around 1910. And it's a boot. And it doesn't give you his name, but that's to represent Arnold and being shot in the leg. And there's a story, I don't know if it's true or not, but he supposedly asked some American, what will happen if the Americans capture me? And the American said, well, we'll bury your leg with full military honors, but we'll hang the rest of you. But I think for whatever reason, we don't picture the whole campaign as a success. And I'm assuming it's because of Arnold that we don't say the whole campaign is a success. But, sure, we lost the first battle, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. I asked a friend of mine in the Army, Chris Ireland, and I asked him, what's the term where you fight and lose? He says, well, let's go to tactical retreat, yeah, that was
what led the French to join.
Yes, I don't know if you heard, but after witnessing this, the French were willing to openly help us with the revolution.
With their ships.
Yeah, yeah. So this whole northern, and let's also say 100 years, not 100 years later, a year or two later, Congress again said, let's attack Canada. Now, one of the interesting things about Canada is we wanted it to be a 14th colony. It wasn't a land grab. The colonies didn't get along with each other. You know, what are we going to do with all this land? They wanted the Quebec to join the Americans. Now, what they thought they had going for them was the French had only been defeated 14 years earlier, you know, and so they thought they'd want to. I think for the most part, the French says, let's see, join those crazy New England Puritans? I think we'll wait, see what happens. A number of French people were hung after Arnold left Quebec.
Some of our folks need to do a tactical retreat.
I'm sorry.
I don't.
I thought
like to drive.
I thought I was
when
told
it's still
that.
light out.
I thought I was told I had 5 hours. Yeah. Oh, one other thing. As you pack up, Arundel, fiction. I think the guy unfairly blames the boat builder, but I think most Mainers, if they know the Arnold story, it's because of Arundel. 2 nonfiction books. One is called Arnold's March from Cambridge to Quebec, 1903, packed with facts. And then a Benedict and Almost Army, a much newer book, same thing, you know, packed with accurate information. I mean, he gives you the source. Both of them give you the source of the information. So that's your assignment. You have to read it.
Any of you want to stay? If you have questions for Ralph,
Yeah.
go ahead. But I don't want to tie you up too long here. So
I have one. How did Arnold get out? If he'd been in, and, you know, they've been all captured. I mean,
Well, see, Arnold,
how did he get out of Quebec the first time?
he wasn't captured.
Oh, he was.
See, he was shot in the leg and taken to a hospital off. And there's this whole story about he's in the hospital not far from the walls of Quebec, and his soldiers say, we need to move you further away. And he refused, and he made them give him like 2 loaded pistols and a sword or something.
But the ones who were captured will end up being paroled.
Yeah, I mean, this was common, is that, see you later, by the next